From chugging incessant amounts of water, to downing a variety of supplements, to smoking cigarettes, to experimenting with a cocktail of pharmaceuticals. It seems that people are frantically trying to search for ways to control their appetite. In fact, it's estimated that by 2028, the diet pill industry is going to be worth over $2 billion. So it's pretty clear that people are concerned with their appetite and trying to find ways to control it. But what if everything that we needed to regulate our appetite already existed within us? Today, I'm going to be talking about exercise and its effect on our appetite from both a physiological and psychological perspective. I will be referencing a scientific publication that will be diving into the psychobiology of hunger. I will be referencing work from Dr. Mark Hopkins, who has contributed tremendously to the research in energy balance and exercise physiology. And finally, I will be exploring themes from this book, Pleasure, written by Alexander Lowen, who is the father of bioenergetics. So, without further ado, let's dive in. I will also have as many resources as possible listed in the description box below. In this first article discussing the psychobiology of hunger, this article wanted to explore two questions. One, does habitual physical activity increase hunger? And number two, does a sedentary lifestyle decrease hunger? They looked at a study that took place over 60 years ago in Calcutta, India. This study wanted to explore the relationship between energy expenditure, food intake, and body weight in workers. So this took place in a real-life workplace setting. These workers were categorized into different groups based on their occupational energy expenditure. That ranged from sedentary, which would include things like office workers, all the way to very heavy work, for example, a blacksmith. In the medium to very heavy workers, what they noticed is that their energy expenditure closely matched their energy intake. However, when it came to the sedentary or light workers, it became clear that their energy expenditure was a lot lower than their food intake. They were eating more than their bodies needed. What this study reveals to us is that habitual physical activity actually improves the calibration of appetite control. That means being able to feel when you're hungry, being able to feel when you're satisfied, and being able to match energy intake versus energy expenditure. By contrast, when people are less physically active, it seems to lead to a dysregulated appetite, which ultimately results in increased hunger and increased food intake. Dr. Mark Hopkins and others expanded on this finding and found out what it was exactly about habitual physical activity that led to this improved appetite control. And what they found was that fat-free mass and resting metabolic rates were both important drivers to hunger and energy intake. Both of these contribute to the motivation to consume food, which also works alongside the satiety hormones that are released from the gastrointestinal tract. What Dr. Hopkins and his team also observed is that when they administered weight loss exercise interventions to individuals, the response was highly varied. So much so from both a biological and behavioral standpoint that they found it impossible to predict how any one person would respond to an exercise program. What Dr. Hopkins and other researchers want to highlight here is that hunger is truly a psychobiological system. While, yes, there is a biological aspect here that we can observe and quantify, there's also this psychological aspect. I mean, after all, we are human beings, and there are so many different things that influence our behaviors. With respect to exercise and food, I'm going to give you a few examples of some rules or things that just impact our behavior that you might be familiar with. When resistance training, you should consume a fast-absorbing protein and carb 30 to 60 minutes after your workout. If you're preparing for an endurance event, you should carb load the night before. Fasted cardio is superior to fed cardio. If you're powerlifting, you should eat everything in the kitchen sink. The more physically active you are, the more protein you should eat. These are all examples of how our culture and society kind of shapes the way we eat before and after exercise. And I'm not saying at all that these rules are bad. I'm actually a huge advocate for dietary suggestions when they are evidence-based. They help us make informed decisions about our nutrition, and I think they help us in the self-care aspect of eating. However, I do think that in this modern day and age, we have gotten used to forfeiting our personal power to these external institutions and waiting to be told what to eat rather than tuning into feedback from our own body and trusting our intuition to help guide our behaviors. Researchers and scientists openly admit all the time that they don't have all the answers. In fact, Dr. Hopkins himself said that he really doesn't know why there's such a huge variability in the way people respond to exercise interventions, but it will be one of the main focuses of research in the next few years for him. The point is, we can't wait for science to tell us what to do with ourselves next. I think that we've been getting used to receiving this rule book from our external peers, media, culture, all of it, and we've really gotten away from tuning into our own body and what it is that feels good for us. This forfeiting of our wisdom removes a great deal of pleasure and creativity from our lives. I mean, just imagine if somebody gave you a book of cheat codes to life that said A equals B every single time. You would go through life knowing exactly what was going to happen. I mean, how boring would that be? I think part of the beauty in life that evokes wonder and this explorative desire is putting on that artist archetype and truly taking back the paintbrush and creating the most magnificent, unique piece of artwork that we have ever seen. To assist us in diving into the topic of pleasure, I will delegate to Alexander Lowen in this book, Pleasure. This is a great read. I highly recommend it, but I am going to read a quote. One reason for the lack of pleasure in our lives is that we try to make fun out of the things that are serious while we are serious about those activities that should be fun. I think this quote is relevant for how you might experience exercise. Maybe you've used it as a form to control yourself or punish yourself, and we can definitely rewire our relationship with exercise, approaching it from a place of playfulness and exploration. I'm going to read another quote from this book that I think is relevant to the topic of this video. But when love and joy are missing from our life, we dream of happiness and run after fun. We fail to realize that the foundation for a joyful life is the pleasure we feel in our bodies, and that without this bodily pleasure of aliveness, living becomes the grim necessity of survival from which the threat of tragedy is never absent. If you've made it this far in the video, then maybe you resonate with feeling that your appetite is literally your worst enemy, that without controlling it constantly and being mindful of it always, that it's just going to take over and you're going to eat and keep gaining weight, and ultimately you're going to be unlovable. The more that our focus goes towards our appetite and trying to control it, the less it's able to go towards actually being in our lives and enjoying what it means to be a human being. Rather than being a human being, you're being a human doing. I stole that from John Brashaw, which love the saying. We're constantly doing and trying to do this to our bodies and do that to our bodies. But what happens if we actually embody, if we actually come into ourselves and experience the pleasure of aliveness, the pleasure of curiosity, the pleasure of wonder and exploration, being able to move and truly enjoy movement because we are appreciating what it is that our bodies can do. All of these different things that we can explore in our bodies that are honestly being robbed by this notion that exercise is a way to control ourselves. I think the more that we can come into our bodies, the less focused we will be on appetite, and the more vibrant of a human being we will be. So at this point in the video, it's clear that exercise positively impacts fat-free mass, resting metabolic rate, satiety hormone signaling, and the overall calibration of our appetite system. It's also clear that these benefits come from a consistent movement practice. So my invitation to you is to relax into the opportunity of discovering and exploring the movement practice that brings you the utmost pleasure and inspires you day in and day out. So with that, I want to thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope you found it helpful. Stay tuned for my next video in this series, which is going to be about fitness trackers and how that impacts our weight and appetite. And with that, I hope you have a great rest of your day.